Thank you for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce Hashim Sarkis to SCI-Arc. I will go through a little bit of his multiple accomplishments, but I think before I do that, I think it's worth to point out that I think his presence is a very interesting moment in relation to the kind of a cultural geopolitical moment that we are living in. And you will find out through his work and his career, a dedicated work of a scholar and intellectual thinking about the merging and the intersection of multiple cultures. And I think this is important thing to notice, and it's an important thing to frame in the body of the work. So Hashim is an architect, an educator, and a scholar. He has been a professor at Harvard and GSD for a long time, in which he was as well the Aga Khan Professor in Landscape Architecture and Urbanism in Muslim societies, and also directed the GSD Aga Khan program. And this is a little bit what I'm saying, that his body of work in that front has been really important in the development of how we establish conversation of multiple ontologies in terms of trajectories of cultures and many other aspects that pertain to design. He established his own firm in 1998, Hashim Sarkis Studios in 1998, as I said. He worked for several firms, including Rafael Moneo, which is also a very interesting mix of background for Hashim. And recently, as you probably all know, has been appointed the Dean of MIT, which is another interesting landmark in his accumulation of experiment in his career. Despite what people may think, MIT and GSD are very different entities, and it's always interesting to see how people go back and forth between those two territories. So as a newly appointed director, I'm very curious to see what Hashim will do with the culture of MIT. And I'm very curious to see his lecture tonight, which, as far as I understand, he says it focuses in one single project. And that's a very unusual experience for us here in SCI-Arc, which we tend to be much more overloaded with images and content. So please please join me to welcome Hashim Sarkis to SCI-Arc.
Thank you very much, Hernan, for this very generous introduction. I am very honored to be invited to speak here at SCI-Arc, which I consider one of the last bastions of intensity and optimism about architecture today. These are indispensable qualities for an architectural practice. For an architectural practice to effectively operate in a world of increasing uncertainty, and I say that from experience, be it in Beirut or in Boston. In the Middle East today, we ask, how can we possibly build on a scorched earth? To whom do we build when every fourth citizen is a refugee? In what context when our cities are swept by destruction or by protest, and our rural areas by drought and abandonment? In the face of violence, architecture may not be able to stand its own grounds, and sometimes I feel it should not. However, in places like Lebanon, where precariousness and uncertainty still teeter on the edge of brinksmanship, one could argue that what architects confront is but a slightly more exaggerated condition of the uncertainty that they face everywhere else in the world. Slippery economic cycles, increasing dependency on unpredictable public deliberation, programs that may change unexpectedly because of changes in real estate consultants, and stylistic clocks that make the buildings under construction already obsolete. This Heraclitean river, that is the world, could carry architecture to its demise. But somehow, I continue to build. We continue to build. But based on what premises? In 2012, we won a competition for the design of the town hall of Byblos, a city just north of Beirut. The competition was open, it was anonymous, and it was in black and white. It was in black and white because the jury that consisted of the deans of different universities there decided that in order to make it a fair competition, and fairness usually means equity socially and economically, printing in color would be expensive, so making it in black and white would allow everybody to participate. Indeed, it was an unusually popular competition. But what I would like to do today, I would like to describe how the building went from black and white to color, and how it went from being a project to becoming a building. Along the way, I would like to reflect on how a building relates to a larger practice, how a practice evolves building by building, and how the premises of such a practice are also incrementally articulated and revised to solidify slowly to become something like grounds, as perhaps the only certain grounds for practice. Architecture itself provides the image of stability and permanence, but set in uncertainty, architecture becomes a stabilizing presence, or to borrow from Paul Bowles, perhaps more like a sheltering sky. Its success is based on how it calibrates its attachment or detachment from the earth, how it times its anachronisms, and how it measures the displacement of what it proposes as forms of space against the forms of life in order to contain them, but also transform them. When we first got the brief for the competition, we were shocked by the site. The site was a highway interchange island at the entrance of the city. And we thought that we would send back the 4 boards that would say, change the site. But we decided to compete. The team in Beirut was actually quite thirsty for doing design work, and we thought over the Christmas break we would just sit down and accept the site conditions as they were. For us, working in coastal cities along the Mediterranean, especially in Lebanon, has been quite frequent, and it has always brought with it exceptional and sometimes very difficult site conditions. Sometimes we were involved in the selection of the sites, but the choices were not always ideal. One such difficult condition of site was the housing for the fishermen of Tyre, a historic city, World Heritage Site like Byblos, that is a peninsula along the Mediterranean, where the fishermen were forced to move out of the historic city in order to get better housing, and formed a cooperative and built their housing along the edges of agricultural fields. I was involved early on, so I got to help in the selection of the site, but the choice was mostly in this area. And in this case, we worked with the planning authority to go from the tobacco and radish fields that were there to a project that would be planted as a precursor to future development that they were planning for the area. The hope here was that the building would capture the grain of the agricultural fields long after they are replaced by buildings of a very different size and grain, but also to create the moments at the intersections of public activity outside, and a common space inside that captures or preserves, in a way, the grain of the agricultural terrains. Somehow the conditions around the site remain the same, some development precariously growing everywhere, but the road network that was planned has yet to be developed. And even though we understood the space to be a common ground for the community of the fishermen and the neighborhood around, it has yet to live up to that expectation. The shop around the corner works quite well in capturing crowds from inside and out. The space inside has become more of an activity for kids because they're quite well connected, but really the better social activity happens in those gaps, interstices between the buildings where the fishermen hang out, mostly in the afternoon, preparing for the fishing at night. Another moment where the site selection was a very difficult one was for a park, a temporary park for a balloon landing on the edges of Beirut. And here we were given a choice of several sites. These would be temporary for activities like cycling and horseback riding, as these parcels were being built and turned into towers. On this site, for example, now there's a tower by Herzog and de Meuron going. But the idea here again was that we would capture the possibility of public space for a short period of time, even though it's temporary, and create with the slope an articulation of the geography of the site that would highlight these difficult conditions, the idea of a layered earth, and the possibility of pulling in the crowds into the site and creating a big public space. And for a brief moment of time, that worked. But somehow, even here, the conditions of publicness were quite vulnerable. It's a vulnerability that I carry with me as a kind of fear in the project of Byblos as well. In both projects and in Byblos, there's also this tension between the ground and the building on top. In this competition for Istanbul, what we ended up doing was try to exaggerate the loose connectedness on the ground with a series of axes that link to the different communities, cutting into a mound at the base, whereas the high-rises created an axis that is much more connected to the distant geography of the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn. And so these two layers of a ground that is connected and a set of towers that is deliberately connected to a distance and disconnected from the ground was the play that we did here. The conditions of the ground in Byblos are even more challenging. The historic city is facing the Mediterranean. Byblos is known to be one of the oldest inhabited cities in the world, probably the second after Damascus, continuously inhabited. And when the French were in Lebanon during the 20s and 30s, they uncovered a lot of archaeological finds in the historic city and slowly removed the residents of the city and turned this into an archaeological dig. This used to be the downtown. This is the only house that is left from the old city. And then it became a World Heritage Site. And with a succession of mayors that have been quite active, they've revitalized the downtown, even though there's very little left of it, because the population here moved to the outskirts of the city. And now Byblos is itself a World Heritage Site with a lot of activities going on there. And even though the center is a major attraction, the periphery, which is where the new town hall is rather messy. It's like the clutter of any suburb around these small cities in the Eastern Mediterranean. This is the old historic harbor. And the city has, over the years, started preparing for tourists. And sometimes they come, sometimes they don't, depending on the situation in the Middle East. And as you know, the situation has not been very good, especially for tourism. But it's interesting to see signs like this, which include every which language possible, so that they can accommodate to a broader group of tourists. And images like these prevail. Byblos was a main fort during the Crusader times, and some of the churches still exist from that time. And here it is, like your perfect poster of cohabitation of religions, a Muslim woman visiting the Christian church. And here, a Muslim mosque, a small Muslim community in the city next to the Corinthian capitals of the Roman city. And then, as is often the case with these smaller towns, in order to place themselves on the map and attract even more tourists, they create a summer festival right by the harbor next to the famous castle. And here is a concert of the Gorillas about 3 years ago visiting Byblos. For those of you who are fans of the Gorillas, this was a very famous and important moment because it was the first time that they played in public without their masks on. So Byblos made history in different ways as well. But the prevalent condition in the city is waiting and seeing. And even though the shops are open for tourists, not many are coming. And there's this kind of unease about the city atmosphere these days as everybody is waiting for the larger changes in the region, but waiting with different attitudes. The mayor keeps moving forward. There's a lot of energy in terms of the public activities. Partnerships with international organizations have helped. A succession of activities building up have turned the city into a kind of showpiece on the Mediterranean. And a sense of continuing to live while waiting prevails in the city. This is the beach south of the historic site with that iconic house, which is now turned into a site for storage of archaeology. Incidentally, Byblos gets its name from Greek, and it has given its name to the Bible because Byblos was the famous trading port for paper, papyrus coming from Egypt, and the Greeks used to use it from there. And so the Bible has its name from Byblos, meaning the book. But in Arabic, it is called Jubail. So the municipality is called Byblos Jubail together. So back to the site. Here we are on a highway interchange in an island that is God-forsaken, except for this side, which is the arrival of the buses of the tourists who take an underpass, walk on the Roman Cardo to get to the historic city here. What we chose to do was to just respect the program very carefully and locate the buildings as three separate forms respecting the program division and allow for the park underneath to continue. There's a clearer image that shows the parking, the United Nations UNESCO Tourist Information Center, and the Roman access that leads to the historic city. We inherited residues of a park that we're trying very hard now to unify. I'll talk about it later. But otherwise, it's really an impossible condition. There's very fast traffic coming in. To slip into the site is very difficult, and then to slip out as well is going to be quite difficult. This is the major interchange, not just to get you into the city, but to get you to those distant, the close-by suburbs where most of the people from Byblos now live. Not to conflate the projects, but this is a recent view taken by an MIT Media Lab student who was flying a helium balloon to take pictures of the historic city, but somehow the wind drifted the balloon over the site, and he took those pictures and sent them to me. I do not know why the pictures look red, the trees look red. But you can see here the fast traffic of the highway, the ramp in and out, and then the way that the three buildings are located. For the competition, the volume was pretty much the same, except that this middle piece was rotated differently. We opened it up more this way because the mayor wanted to have his office facing the fortress, and then the afternoon sun was actually quite convenient to bring in indirectly from the west. But the site conditions have come back to haunt us because of the reality of having to bring cars in and out, connecting to tourists. One of the blocks became a museum in the process, and we've had to deal with the city bit by bit. We did not know the client, and the client did not know us. So when the announcement was made, we had to meet with them on a regular basis. The Municipal Council of Byblos is a very young group and very active group. Sometimes the activity takes them in too many directions. When I stand here, can you hear me? Am I okay here? No? Should I go back there? Okay. This is the mayor. He's hardly 40. And the profiles of the members is relatively young compared to municipal councils everywhere else in Lebanon. And believe it or not, the women representation is relatively high. This is just one woman on the council. But considering the rest of the country, it's quite open. They were ready for action, and they came back with many suggestions. They realized full well that the Ministry of Public Works that gave them the piece of land gave it to them because they could do nothing else with it. But they really understood that locating it there would be a very good bridge between the two sites, and happy coincidence of the alignment with the Cardo was a very important one for them. But then we started working with them on understanding the site and how one approaches the site. So instead of working from the urban design to the building, we worked from the building out to the urban design. And luckily, they were quite open to different suggestions. Initially, they wanted to put a big parking under the municipality building in order to absorb all the traffic, but the entrances to the city at that point were so congested, we convinced them against that. And we worked with them to develop a framework for a Byblos town plan, which we've subsequently passed on to a Rockefeller Foundation team that is working with the city, and we're involved on developing these different factors, these different aspects of the city. A transportation plan for the metropolitan area, a land use plan for the town, highlighting the key public spaces and sites, and using them as sites for public-private partnerships, particularly because of their location next to entrances but locked to parking, improving the highway frontage, and then working on the town hall site plan itself. I'm showing you now just a series of images that are really the stuff that we got. For those of you who work in larger regional plans, you must realize how difficult it is to assemble a plan that is coherent out of the different municipalities. So this is the group of municipalities of the region coming together to say, we want a regional transport plan, let's do that. These are the documents that we're working on right now with them and with the municipality, with the Rockefeller. An initial one is simply to help clarify the clear connection north-south, Beirut to Tripoli, along the Mediterranean, and east-west into the hinterland and the suburbs, trying to improve on the hierarchy of the streets because they're quite messy by highlighting the primary from secondary to tertiary, and then creating conditions of connectedness across the highway because it's a major breaker between the old city and the mountains by creating this loop and highlighting its role for public transportation. And here we're working with them right now to get the buses that they use for tourists off-season to work as a loop for carrying people around. Reusing some of the coastal areas and railroad tracks for pedestrian links. And then also using the north-south walkways, which are still pedestrian, for connection, for hiking, and for connections through introducing other forms of tourism into the site. The big picture is yet to gel, but this is how it looks more or less now. The discussions with the Rockefeller Foundation are still around questions of participation and deliberation processes within the city, but these issues are still on the table. And they are important for us to keep on the table because for the operation of the building itself and its connectedness to the larger city, many of these questions have to be addressed. And then this is the highway frontage question, which is still in front of us. But perhaps the most immediate impact for us on the town hall site is the clarification of these two second entrances. As a way of releasing traffic from this area, we proposed, and hopefully it will begin to happen, that these two entrances get pronounced more as you're approaching the city from both sides, so that not all the traffic happens here. And I'm hoping that in the coming few months with the Rockefeller, we will be able to change that. Also, with the growing interest in agro-tourism, we're trying to link all of that to the northern side of the city and to its preservation, which is still now agricultural fields, but very vulnerable to development. On the site itself, in terms of approach, you would drive in, come along the edge of the building, and then come back out. We're putting some parking here, trying to convince them that it's better to put all the parking on the other side, and then create a noise barrier along the highway that would go slip under the building and come out the other side, and that would be an outdoor display next to the park for art related to the Alphabet Museum, which is here. Byblos prides itself for being the source of the first phonetic alphabet in history. The Greeks, in doing commerce with the Phoenicians, took that alphabet and turned it their own, and subsequently it became the base for all phonetic alphabets, including the Latin one. And Byblos is trying now to incorporate in this third block a alphabet museum. I'll get to that in a bit. So ultimately, the three volumes float over this wall. As you're driving up and down, you see them ambiguous size because of their flatness on the outside. Not clear what scale they're at. But their main role is to link the two sides together Their repetitiveness suggests some institutional character, but their oddness, as a kind of attempting to adjust to the irregular geometry of the site, points to the immediate conditions of the site and projects them along the axis and along the highway to a larger geography that they're on. When we got the program, it was very clear and clearly spelled out that it is made of 3 pieces. One piece would be for administrative offices. One piece would be for the mayor's offices and the municipal council. And one piece was going to be a multi-use building, and subsequently it became a museum. Our main concern was to maintain the continuity of the ground. This is a public building. Maintaining the continuity of the park through the building was quite important for us. And creating a plaza at the end, which will work as the reverse entrance to this multi-use building after hours, especially from the museum. And the 3 volumes share the lobby and the control area, and many of the activities that you would do for paying a parking ticket, paying your taxes, can happen in the lobby. You don't have to go up. For me, this was a little bit unusual because for the longest time, I've tried to interfere in program. Having worked a lot with non-governmental organizations where the programs were always in gestation as you were defining what the project is and raising money for it, I've always tried to figure out ways that we can save on money and be creative with the building by being creative with the program. In this case, we refrained from it. We kept the ground open with the lobbies, and then the 3 volumes working with the activities inside them. In this case, there was an iteration early on that it would be an auditorium, but then after that it became a museum. And these are the plans almost as built. Please keep these columns in mind. They will come back to haunt me and haunt you later on. And now this is the plan showing the museum component. And this is the mayor's office, which has also been a big fight because I had initially understood it to be small, and slowly it started growing and becoming quite exclusive. And that's the roof plan. Working with NGOs, this is an agricultural center in North Lebanon, which is half finished, as is always the case with NGO projects. This is the one that I tried to save on space by making the different program elements in it share spaces. Just to give you a sense of the complexity of the plan, a dairy factory, a public service entrance, showroom and shop for selling produce, an industrial teaching kitchen, a technology school for helping farmers with different skills. All of these had to share the same space, including a nursery on the upper level. So in working out the program, in order to make it smaller, we came up with a series of diagrams of how these open spaces outside can be used for spillover, including for instruction. And if they worked out their calendar correctly, the schedule correctly, then they can save on space. Well, that did not work. Many of the outdoor spaces were colonized by the activities inside, and they became quite exclusive. Until today, the cohabitation among these different programs is quite uneasy. The thing that remains is probably the sectional clarity of this building in connection to the terrain, occupying ground on the lower level and occupying ground on the upper level, and creating a kind of very strong horizontal connection across the olive fields to the Mount Lebanon in the background, which, even though the building is not finished, that view is pretty much there. We did the same with an olive oil press, where we thought that by creating a walkway for the farmers to walk around, we would be satisfying the hygiene requirements of the olive oil factory, but the farmers have refused to abandon their olives. And they wanted to carry them through because you have to be involved in the pressing process. And except for these rather antiseptic pictures, the place right now is a complete mess with the farmers walking up and down and the hygiene standards quite radically compromised. But the idea was that it would be like a car wash up there. So back in Byblos, we decided that programmatically we would stick to what is given, and that Here again, we would preserve mostly and enhance the public space dimension of the project. We didn't want to try to interfere in the program. Until today, the program, as I will describe, is changing. This condition of the public realm being the one that holds the project together, we tested in the project of the balloon. But in the balloon, as with Byblos, perhaps if you can think about it sectionally, the program was interpreted in a very simple way. A big open space in the middle to capture the public realm, but then a perimeter, in this case it is underground, that would house the different activities and programs that would be given opportunity to spill out. So to help interpret and reinterpret the space through the intensity of the edges that are around it. One could talk about this intense edge open space as a courtyard condition, and it happens to be the case in the balloon, but it is intercepted by a sectional slip. And that same condition now we're working on with this series of villas just north of Byblos, like a 10-minute drive, which is a series of houses for a family that we're calling the court towers, because they're a combination of a courtyard and tower. But here again, the idea of interpreting the program not by interfering in it, but by exaggerating the common areas against the support areas that will be pushed to the perimeter is how these houses have been interpreted. And here again, because of the nature of the terrain, the houses are embedded in the landscape, and the section is what connects the different levels. In this particular case, the perimeter works as structure, it works as program, and it also works as barrier against the elements. There's a service way here for insulation and for support of the mechanical systems, and then all of the program is pushed to the side, creating a big clear span in the middle. And then the tower itself operates the same way, where you have a barrier to the sun from the east and the south with these programs, and then the space itself of the bedrooms is completely open on the side, behaving like a balcony. That's the plan, the courtyard and the tower. Actually, even this element is not structural. The tower is held from these sides. That's the model. And this idea of the intense edge is taken further in the way that the facades themselves work. Just to show you, the tower itself unwraps to reveal that solidity in the void inside. And this condition happens along the pool edge where you see the inside. And here, the outer wall of the building is actually a thick inhabited surface. It's inhabited with the bathrooms. And that window that you saw is actually the sink, where the side windows bring light from the side, but the mirror reflects the garden back into the bathroom. And these closets are actually both closets, filling in the poché of the facade, but they're also a cooling system for the house and heating system. We're relying on a gravity wall system which takes cold water out of the sea and uses a kind of refrigerating radiator essentially behind it. So there's no air being pumped. It's all a very passive system. Hot air comes in and cold air comes back out. And the reverse happens in the winter. But this is the condition of the edge of the pool as well, where this thickness becomes inhabited with the different activities, but otherwise the common space is there. We did the same with this mosque competition, where you have an intense edge and an open interior, which is reflected in the plan. And the exterior gives a certain massiveness and poché, including the articulation of the minaret. This project happened at the time, if you remember, where there was a big controversy in Switzerland banning minarets. And in Qatar, because these were daily mosques inside neighborhoods, they didn't want the minarets to be too pronounced. So we created the minaret out of the volume of the mass by just chopping the corner open. But then the interior is a completely large open space, which is scooped out, carved out by the volume. We're experimenting with strategy with other projects. This is a Aga Khan Academy that is basically just master plan in the town of Sabura. And you can see how the master plan itself is organized as a perimeter that protects the interior, which is the residential component. But then every one of these elements itself becomes a courtyard building that lock into each other as clusters, but ultimately also lock with the landscape, its slope, and with the ravines that happen inside it. In many ways, I feel that we made the right choice in Byblos in terms of not trying to intervene in the program. The uncertainty of the different elements and their flux is still today quite bothersome. This is the museum volume, and what we did, a later intervention, is create an opening for light from the top and create a mezzanine for the activities. But interestingly, we are still waiting for the objects to come. We're building ahead of understanding how this museum will be programmed, because there are very few pieces that can be brought here. So it has to become more of an interactive museum. And here we are building without the curators, without the directors of the museum helping us. But so far, at least the public realm, the area underneath is preserved. So I'm hoping that I made the right bets. One of our aspirations for this project was to make the structure expressive of the way the program works, but also the way the volumes float. 3 space frames that would be floating on top of the wall, supported on both sides by the core on one side and the noise barrier on the other side. These were initial studies that we did first with AKT, but then we realized that the budget was so limited we had to work with a local architect. And we moved from this idea to the idea that the structures of the 3 buildings would be hanging, again expressing the floating over the public passage. That did not work. They were very afraid of it, and they thought that not only the cost, but the labor involved is going to be too intensive, especially on the edge of the highway. So we did a very simple animation to explain that, and we actually posted it on YouTube because we wanted everybody from the city to be involved. But it actually scared them more than helped, in the sense that it showed them how elaborate this whole thing was. So we had to abandon all of this, even though till today I feel that it would not have been much more expensive or costly than what they are doing right now, or what we ended up doing right now. This idea of connecting the structure or structural experimentation with the program or with the form has been something that we've been trying to do for a while. If you are to think about the programmatic strategy of pushing things to the perimeter, then it does create constantly the challenge of big spaces and big spans. And that has been a yearning, I would call it, because it's not yet fulfilled in many of the projects. This is, again, with Adams Karat Taylor, the competition for the Zorlu Center in Istanbul, where one of the main principles of the project was that the lobbies of the towers would be lined up on top of the main spine of the shopping center. And so the buildings were sitting smack on top of the shopping center. And the only way that that could work was by the structure of the building transferring to the sides and the passage happening underneath, with the lobbies hanging in the space and accessed from the sides. But we did not win. In this particular project, the Center for Agriculture, we also tried to produce bigger spans, but that meant just bigger and thicker beams and concrete. And when we started building, we realized that the big spans over the covered courtyards were creating very dull, flat surfaces. And the only way around that was, when we were building, to understand how we can articulate the surface from below. And using this rebar reinforced Hordy block system, which is a very traditional system of construction, we worked with the contractors to lift the Hordy blocks from the rebars. And then when you remove the formwork, you would get a crenulated surface. And this was our sort of simple contribution to the articulation of a big span. With a balloon, we also tried. I really wanted that fold in the ground would allow for a structure that would be these big beams that would hold it open. But the budget, and not only the budget of construction, but the budget of the demolition of the building were very prohibitive. We had to anticipate how this building was to be destroyed. And so we resorted to the use of round columns, and the budget was so low that we initially had curtain walls anticipated, but we ended up using PVC curtains, literally curtains, because we couldn't afford curtain walls. And the round columns were a kind of meant to stand for something that would not be there. So every time I see pilotis these days, I think of them as not there, just out of despair. So we had to come back to the reality of the budget, but also the psychology of the construction. And here we reluctantly accepted to plant columns just along the curtain wall of the glass wall of the lobby. And with a few columns, with 4 of them, we managed, with the help of a good structural engineer, to solve the problem of the span. Initially also, we thought that they would still accept the idea of the big beams on the roof, but because it required that you would carry everything up straight and build this and then hang, they were still afraid of that logic. So we came up with a system where the slabs themselves would act as structural beams, continuous ones, and we abandoned this hanging system. These are the columns planted. And I have to say, they're not that bad after all. And these are the columns sitting in the space of the office. And if you paint them white, they do disappear. This is the box of one of the buildings. This is the main structural element facing the highway. And you can see these small ribs that are there to help hold the walls and the lintels. And in a way, for that brief moment of time, the building did look like a space frame. So we liked that picture. But time came to fill in this space and to actually interpret what we had in black and white as a surface for the building in actual material and in actual color. What we had submitted was a kind of shorthand in Photoshop like this. The lower wall is the existing planter wall, as a retainer wall. The upper wall is the noise barrier, and then the 3 boxes, just with the shorthand of PowerPoint and the shortness of time that we had, we sort of just took sandstone walls from the city, sandstone being the kind of official stone of Byblos, and we plastered them at a very different scale than one would expect. So if you look at these, each stone is almost 3/4 of a floor high, which you cannot find in sandstone. But time came to interpret the material. And I actually really don't like sandstone. I don't like it for different reasons. One is it's not a very reliable stone. Its color is unpredictable. It crumbles very quickly. And even in Byblos, even in the whole country, it's never been meant to be exposed. It was always the fill material that you would plaster over, or sometimes even use limestone to cover it, especially on exterior. So we thought that maybe this is an opportunity for us, as we're working to develop this idea of ambiguous scale, to try to make big panels that looked like stone but were not stone. In terms of their coloration, we were also not sure whether we would stick to sandstone or do something else. Now, coloring is a difficult thing, especially for us as architects. And there's a certain arbitrariness to it which we do not like, even though we accept arbitrariness in many ways. But when it comes to color, somehow we cringe. We don't deal with it. I've had to deal with this challenge in another project, which is the housing for the fishermen. In this project, again, money became the issue, and we had to finish very quickly. And immediately after this plastering work, the contractor said, we're running out of money. We cannot do the second finish that you were hoping for to get the surfaces flat, and we're not going to be able to use the spray paint, the spray powder that would give it a roughness and surface for stenciling. We only have money for color, for paint. And I said, any color? They said, all colors are the same price. So I started experimenting with color, went to therapy to treat my chromophobia, and came back with a very wild palette that was inspired by some vernacular colors from Joseph Albers, from many other colorists and compositions, but ultimately it was quite arbitrary. The idea was that we would group forms to create unusual groupings and clusters using the colors, and that we would try to counter the sun by putting the brighter colors on the sides that didn't get that much sun and the warmer ones on the sides that got the sun. Also, at that time, just to again enhance the arbitrariness of it all, I had a Turkish architect working with me in the office, and he said, in Ottoman architecture, they use the cold colors on the outside and the warm colors on the inside. So we went Ottoman. And actually it helped, because what is very nice about that is that it allows for the spilling over of the warm colors to come out in these cracks between the forms. And we use the colors to create groupings that allowed us to move away from the repetitive nature of the window or the unit and from the overall mass itself. So it became a kind of formal exercise in intermediary scale grouping. But most importantly, it helped hide the mistakes. And it does help in hiding a lot of the plastering mistakes. There's a corner where you're looking at the inside. This is the back. These are the kind of gaps between the forms. And this is the same corner from the inside and the outside. And that's the interior with this grouping forms. We use the same arbitrary coloration on the Strada Novissima in Shenzhen Biennale about, I'm going to say, 5 years ago. And here we wanted to adhere to the facade but recede from the facade. And we used the color blue as a way of helping it float, but also to play this ambivalence between it being aligned and being pulled away from the street. But in the case of Byblos, the coloration was one to be probably more in tune with the materials themselves, meaning that it had to draw clues, like coloring old black and white photographs, from the materiality of the objects that one is working with. Hints, references to a certain naturalism, not necessarily accurate, but manipulating those. So, for example, this photograph of Abraham Lincoln, we know to a certain extent the color of his skin. We know that his shirt was white. Whether his bow tie was really red or not, I'm not sure there's a science that can reassure us that that was historically correct. Maybe factual descriptions can do that, or particularly that kind of red. And we had done that game, we had played that game with other buildings as well. This was a branch library that was never built in Beirut, where we worked with the sand color to give the concrete facade different hues, so different aggregates and different sand colors to transform the coloration of it. And with the balloon, we actually worked with pigment that matched the color of the soil to enhance the idea of excavation and cutting into the ground. So the formwork of the wood, which is the same as the formwork of the concrete, looks like a kind of hatching into the ground. And we even used cement to color the wood and paint to color the cement so that they would begin to match much more. Every which way we tried, the municipal council insisted you have to use sandstone. Not only did they insist, but they bought the sandstone and shipped it to the site, and they dropped it on the site. So we were, in a way, stuck with it. But here I'm hopefully going to convince you why sandstone is not a great stone. Look at the way it is used in this modern building. Look at the inconsistency of the color. Here they're trying very hard to make it look like something else, so they antiquated it in the old town. They're discovering it under many of the barrel vaults in the churches, under the plaster. So they remove the plaster and expose it, but it's beginning to crumble and absorb moisture. But this has become like a national trend. And then here they apply it sporadically to many of the buildings along the highway to give a certain historical facade to the city. There's some successful examples, particularly the ones that try to use to protect the joints, because the joints are a very difficult thing to deal with, by filling them in and creating a second layer. It's a kind of traditional technique, but it works. But it is being brought in everywhere, and it's being exposed everywhere in the city. And this is the temporary headquarters of the municipality, which is a new building built out of sandstone with false arches and false brick roofs. And this is, if I didn't get the hint, this is the municipal election office of the mayor, and all the meetings were happening here. And here it is being thrown everywhere. And the justification has always been that, well, the two castles of the city are made of sandstone, you should use the sandstone. But if you notice, the towers of the historic castle are covered with limestone as well. Here it is crumbling in front of a shop. And this is our building at the end of the Roman axis, which admittedly compels us, forces us to make it belong to that sequence, to that kind of ritual promenade between the sea castle, the land castle, and then the town hall. We tried to run away with making it more porous, making it made out of different bands, but this would not hold, it would crumble. We justified it by the screens, but this was also exorbitantly expensive. It's kind of patterns that would work with the movement along the highway and shapes that would vary along the way. But accidentally, I ran into a piece of stone, which was a very beautiful yellow travertino marble that we were buying for the bathrooms of the villas that I just showed earlier. And the client of the villas did not like this piece of stone, but I thought that the pattern and the colors resembled very much the colors of the sandstone, except that they were so beautifully organized in these bands that I decided, well, maybe we can make the sandstone look like this. So we translated this image into pixels and managed to achieve the effect with 4 colors, and then tried combinations with other colors to give it a vein, but we ultimately ended up with just these 4 colors. First, we thought that we would distinguish between the cuts, but we managed with the 4 colors to achieve this effect. They had given us big sheets of sandstone, about 40 by 60, but to achieve the pixelation, we cut them into very small pieces and distributed them by color. When you have a big sheet, it's very difficult to define which color it's in. But when you cut it into small bands, you can say, well, this is light yellow, light orange, dark orange. We also took the travertino sheet and we stretched it in order that it would wrap around all 3 buildings, and to create an effect that they are all cut out of the same block. We went to the site, and with the workers, we sort of first cut a batch and then assembled them into different colors, built the scaffolds, painted patches of white paint to correspond to different shades, and with the construction workers on the scaffolds, some of them up there and the foreman down below, we started laying them out. Obviously, there were some mistakes that we could fix, but once we got the rhythm right, it went very fast. Also did one thing which is expressed when you came close, the thinness of the stone, rather than try to make it look massive, so that when you see it from a distance, you see it's a big sheet. When you come closer, you realize it's pixelated, and then when you come even closer, you realize how thin it all is. And this is the hero of the day, Muallim Nazmi, a Syrian construction worker who helped us figure out how to do all of this. And we did it without mortar on the front. It's just a gluing of the pieces on the wall. And you can see the stacks of stones that we got and the facade behind it. So we went from essentially this to this and now to that. Perhaps the last aspect of the building I want to talk about is this idea of inscription. When we presented the competition, the idea was that we would have trellis underneath the buildings and then same screen that would go up in between the facades. As we tried to interpret that into material and budget, we thought that maybe here again we can introduce, as the museum idea became a reality, we thought that here maybe we can begin to introduce some reference to the alphabet, some reference to the identity of the city as the creator of the world alphabets. So went back to a bad habit. We all have bad habits. And one of my bad habits, which started as a child, was a love for writing on walls. And it stayed on with me because for some reason I liked it, the idea that the surface of a building can become a surface for expression with other means. But also because there's something very beautiful about inscription, which I post-rationalized, that has to do with the fact that when you write, you either press in or emboss, and that the writing process involves a hand, which is the hand that makes the surface, and the hand that inscribes from the outside. But unlike ornament or applique, inscription tends to pull out from the tectonic of the building certain attributes and adjusts to them. In the housing for the fishermen in Tyre, initially it was supposed to be like this before it went into color. So we ended up just holding the letters of the alphabet on the facades of the entrances of each building. But we also, in the grouping of colors, we tried to create something like an abstract hieroglyph that would be associated with the project. In the balloon project, we actually literally wrote. The budget was so limited that we brought the asphalt to the interior as if it were a tarmac. This was a balloon port. And we wrote, like you write on the tarmac, games are here, entrance is here, exit is here, departures are here. And the same formwork itself, this where kids had to wait, and they waited just for the picture. But you can see the formwork itself becoming the source of kind of indexical language of entrance exit signs, which when you remove one piece becomes the arrow. But this logic of inscription also works in other scales. In this case, which is a house on the Aegean, we tried not to remove the olive trees, and we inscribed the house as a form between them, and the path that led you to the house itself became the house. So it's almost like a writing of a path or a script in the landscape. And in this facade, even though there's no language, but being a library and an homage to all the blind facade libraries, what we did was we created the windows as a kind of scratching into the surface, juxtaposed in the rectilinearity against the fogginess of the sand. But we had to act on Byblos. And in Byblos, we thought that maybe if we juxtapose the initial alphabet with the barcode, and you know how barcodes have become a kind of fascination with making randomized facades, but we said literally a barcode, literally the word Byblos, so that when you're driving fast, you can use your app, you flash it, and you read Byblos. And we started working with that. I'm not so sure you can still read Byblos, but the intent is there. And because it's oblique and distorted, the idea here was that you would take that, carry it around to become a pergola, and then it would wrap up on the other side. Color again became an issue here, and I want to say that not only color, but color and material. And here again, I do strongly believe that questions of coloration and certain decision-making attributes, decision-making factors in architecture do not always come out of the logic of the sequence of decision-making. They have to come from somewhere else. There is no single source from which all decisions about the building can be made. And we have to accept and entertain and celebrate the idea that decisions come from elsewhere, even if sometimes they come from fashion design. In this case, in looking at the texture of the stone, I was interested in figuring out combinations of color, but also of material textures. And I don't know if many of you know the work of Dries van Noten, the Belgian fashion designer, but he's a master at the combination of textures and colors, and really amazing palettes of colors that come together in his work. And I confess that I borrowed the color palette and the texture palette of Dries van Noten. And obviously it goes through many iterations, but that was the source. Where here you see the curtain wall or barcode facade made out of alucobond Prussian blue, which I liked because it was not the immediate blue and it was not the blue of the sky, but it brought in a different kind of sky into the space. And with the bouncing back and forth of light between the two surfaces, it allowed for a certain depth, a certain interiority to be projected up into the sky itself. This is the view of the interior of the mayor's office. This is the view of the building against the highway. This is the reflectiveness of the two sides. We did not plan that, but the Lebanese flag mast is right down there. And this is the space of the buildings with the hallways. The pergola. Now, all of us who know in this obsession with making horizontals and verticals continuous that it doesn't really work. Once the material changes directions, it changes character and behavior. More importantly, when you start taking mass-produced elements and projecting them at an oblique, on one surface it might be the correct measurement, but when you start the oblique, it breaks. And to match them is almost impossible and will always look like too literal a translation of idea of continuity from drawing into form. And in this case, I chose to just accept the break, accept the parallax, and to create gaps between the horizontals and verticals that allow the eye to make the connection, but also expose the reality of parallax, of disjointedness. And here is the space today. Now, the last element I want to describe is this wall on the left, the noise barrier as it was rendered initially in sandstone, but became an important player in the activation of the museum. I'm going to go out on a limb here to say that I am a bit tired of the idea that architecture can do everything in terms of expression. The fact that we become monomaniacs about every aspect of the form. And that whether it's the tessellation pattern or the geometry that we produce will be dictating every aspect of the building is a bit too obsessive. And there is a possibility that architecture can step out a little bit, can become much more hospitable to other forms of expression other than itself, and that it could accommodate for painting, sculpture, writing, and maybe by different hands. And the fact that this museum was forced to spill out because of running out of space, but also because they wanted to bring it out to the park, suggested that this wall on the left could become itself a mural. And while waiting for this mural to happen, but because the opening is to be in November, we suggested that we can make a mural that looks something like wallpaper, on which art can hang or that can be subsequently replaced by other forms of display, other art forms. So in a very quick way, we just took the Phoenician alphabet, abstracted it into geometric forms, and created a kind of evolving stencil that would provide a backdrop for the space as it opens. So this is a placeholder for the opening, which is happening soon. I just show you a few pictures that were taken 2 days ago. This is the lobby with the installation of the counters for the staff, putting up the glass that separates the courtyard from the inside. This is the staircase, and this is the testing of a Viennese plaster on the lobby walls, which are going to be also Prussian blue. This is the site engineer and project manager from our office. And this is the building as it stands today. So almost 4 years later, Byblos is almost finished. but the design will continue to evolve and will do so for a while to come. I worry. I worry that the public spaces may never be finished, and already I'm seeing some compromises. I worry that the cohabitation between the municipality and the museum may not be happy, learning from precedents of other programmatic cohabitations. And that the open ground floor would eventually be taken over by the next mayor, who would enclose an auditorium, or even worse, add more offices. But if I can extract at the end of this project a provisional set of premises on which we can move forward, I can say the following 3 or 4 points. Perhaps instead of deeply embedded buildings or ones that are extremely detached, I'm more inclined towards buildings that transcend their immediate context by being almost grounded, but slightly levitating in the sky, creating a parallel, an alternative, and maybe a better world. Instead of a programmatically dependent architecture, the work, as you saw, is moving towards spaces that facilitate the program without interfering directly in it, but that rather focus on the commons, and that also encourage other forms of different inhabitation that can come out of the architecture with time. I also see a strong role for structure, even though unrealized, in enabling this approach and protecting it. Instead of architecture as uber medium that does everything and that wants to be the unique form of expression, I'm more and more inclined to think of architecture as host for other arts, as the surface into which images from different media are received, assembled, and orchestrated. We make proposals, we build them out of the few certainties that the circumstances offer us. But then we throw them into vast social networks, hoping that they survive in their seductiveness, in their anachronism, in their optimism. But the more open these social networks are, the more vulnerable the architecture is. These premises themselves are evolving, but I can say with certainty on October 14, 2015 at 8:14 p.m., I can say with certainty that I aspire for an architecture that is able to engage, bend a little, but that does not lose its potential as an exercise in world making, nor its recognizability as a project, a proposition, and as an object. But you can ask me at this provisional conclusion, what kind of object? Michel Serres, a French philosopher, has used the ball, the soccer ball, to describe the phenomenon of what he calls the quasi object, where the meaning and value of the object is based partly on its physical attributes, but mostly on the networks that it builds around itself. The soccer ball has little meaning before it enters into the space of the game, between players, who exchange it among themselves and among the audiences that bring it into their space of leisure. They build affinities around it, and they build ideologies. This is, for those of you who are soccer fans, Luis Figo, the Portuguese player wearing the Real Madrid colors, playing. He was a gentleman of a player, he's now retired. These are people in Byblos using soccer and the ball as the source of their social engagement. These are young players in Byblos bringing it indoors in the winter. And this is the famous American team in the Women's Cup today. Serres is here trying to move us from a rigid separation between subject and object, between what he and Bruno Latour call matters of fact to matters of concern, and to describe how social networks are woven around agents that could be as dumb as the ball. In all of their accounts about the social, however, Serres and Bruno Latour spend most of their time talking about the networks and very little time talking about the ball. But they somehow hold on to the ball. It's not dissolved into the system. It's still a quasi-object. Surely here as well, if we think about it in object theory, we are moving from the isolated object or the objet type, that prevailed over our thinking about architecture and about object production in the modernist period to a quasi-object. But it is in part the seductive glow of the ball in its different stitches, leathers, then to polyurethane, and colors, and in part its bouncing attributes that make the game. So no matter what networks it inspires and what uncertainties it is thrown into, the ball has to remain a ball. It is kicked around, it bounces off, but then it falls back in and wears off. Sometimes it accidentally deflates to the player's dismay or delight. There's a joke about the Patriots. But with renewed optimism, after every goal, the game restarts, and the goalkeeper kicks it again, and in that brief moment of suspense and hope, it stands still high against the sky. Thank you very much.